Hello, and welcome to the kickoff of Hello Hemlock 2015, where we will be talking about As For Me and My House by Sinclair Ross. I am so excited to be talking about As For Me and My House on Hello Hemlock. It's one of my all-time favorite novels, and it's the novel that got me into Canada in a serious way, and I've just been waiting for the opportunity to talk about it on the channel. So As For Me and My House was first published in 1941, but it didn't gain very much traction until it was republished in 1957 as part of the first series of McClelland and Stewart's New Canadian Library. The novel, which is set in a town named Horizon during the Great Depression, is told through a series of diary entries of a character named Mrs. Bentley, who is a minister's wife. Her entries span from April 8th, 1939 to May 12th of 1940. And so in this span of time, she records her experience of life in Horizon and her alienation in the town and in her own house and in her own marriage. So everything that we know about Horizon and its inhabitants, we learn through Mrs. Bentley's diaries. The epistolary narration is obviously unreliable, and it can at times create a kind of like distancing effect. And because this is one of my favorite novels of all time, I recommend it ceaselessly. And sometimes people come back to me and say that they didn't really enjoy the novel because they didn't find Mrs. Bentley, who's the narrator of the story, to be very welcoming, and they felt at times like they were being pushed away. And sometimes that's the case. But as William H. New reminds us about the sense of ambivalence in As For Me and My House, Mrs. Bentley's view is not the only one we are conscious of, for the technique of the book, Ross's words in Mrs. Bentley's diary, establishes a linguistic tension that allows us to view the narrator with distance, objectivity, dispassion, and so perceive the irony and ambivalence which characterize reality in Ross's world. In presenting and exploring a single point of view, As For Me and My House runs the danger of seeming shallow, of allowing no aesthetic distance from which we can respond to the narrator as well as participate in her verbal reactions to the world. Fortunately, Ross's technique, his control over the words he allows Mrs. Bentley to use, creates the ironic tension, which raises the book from a piece of regional realism to a complex study of human responses. Mrs. Bentley herself is all too prone to approve or condemn, but Ross would have his readers avoid this. So Mrs. Bentley's diaries are obviously all that we have, the only document through which we can enter Horizon and interact with the characters who inhabit it, and we can only do this through Mrs. Bentley's mind. But there's something else that might be going on with these diary entries, and it's something that Valerie Raoul kind of alerts us to. But first, it's always kind of sketchy when you try to read into an author's biography as a way of entering the text, looking at their life to sort of make sense of what's going on in their work. But there is a particular point that I think that Valerie Raoul thinks is very important, and that is that Sinclair Ross was gay. So when thinking of this, Raoul calls As For Me and My House a palimpsest. She argues that the diary form allows the author both to hide and reveal a subtext related to his forbidden sexual orientation. So it isn't always best practice to look to an author's life to help you interpret their work. But as Richard Moore asserts, for gays, sexuality affects everyday existence, whereas for straights, sexuality, especially what might be called heterosexual presumption, is an unacknowledged phenomenon. For straights, sexuality is like the air at room temperature, pervasive and dominant, yet entirely unnoticed. So there you have it. It might be useful in our case to keep in mind the fact that Sinclair Ross was gay. Particularly for what I want to talk about. Maybe not all the time, but for what I want to talk about. So throughout the novel, Mrs. Bentley repeats that Philip keeps a distance from her, that he sequesters himself away in his study, where he sketches these prairie town landscapes with false-fronted buildings. She writes about the oppressive nature of the house that they share, about the domestic tasks, such as repairing the house, that she can't take part in, even though she's better at them than Philip. And several times in her diary, she remarks that Philip never had the interest in women that other men had. So like I've stressed over and over again, all of these things that she's observing, all of these claims that she's making happen within the pages of her diary. And Raoul connects this to a narrative technique that wasn't very prominent in English Canada, but was prominent in France and Quebec. What she says about this type of narration is that it has often been associated with the questioning of gender identity and sexual orientation. And then Raoul goes and looks at the way that the diary is used, like the purpose of the diary in the novel. And she says, unlike some of the French novels that she looks at that do use it to kind of deal with sexual or gender identity, it isn't part of the plot. It's never reread by Mrs. Bentley. She never kind of like looks over what she wrote to find patterns or to learn something about this span of time. It isn't found by Philip. It isn't read by Philip. And Mrs. Bentley never recognizes the fact that her entries form a sort of narrative. Raoul says the purloined diary remains concealed, and the reader is left wondering whether its hidden meaning, obvious once seen, is known to her, to Philip, or to Ross himself. For once one has recognized the homosexual subtext, it is impossible to ignore it. Indeed, it appears as textually overdetermined. And that's true. I mean, over and over again in her diaries, there is an insistent kind of questioning of why it is that Philip might not be interested in her or in other women. And there are times when she notices that he looks at Judith, who's another character in the novel. Whoops. But again and again she comes back to the fact that the way that he looks at women is different from the way that other men do. Early in the novel she writes, "Women weren't necessary or important to him as to most men. He was the kind to stand back and appraise them, make his decision reflectively. Submitting to him that way, yielding my identity, it seemed what life was intended for. But he, through it all, kept his own stature. He lost the career he wanted, but he retained himself. Untouched by me, he kept on struggling, his own unshareable struggle with things out of reach of a woman or his love for her." Not long after, she writes, "I glanced up and saw a twitch to his lips. There were lines around his mouth that made him seem spent, almost broken. His hand stayed quick and strong on mine as if he wanted me there, as if he were trying to tell me so. It was more of him than I had had in weeks, but afraid to be spendthrift with such a moment, I slipped away from him again. For when he gives himself to me like that, when we come close to each other, always to follow is a sudden mustering of self-sufficiency, a repudiating swing the other way. He resents his need of me. Somehow it makes him feel weak, a little unmanly. There are times when I think he has never quite forgiven me for being just a woman." And then later on in the novel, Mrs. Bentley is reflecting on the sacrifices that she made for Philip, or the little things she did to try to win his affections, these things that she calls little victories. And she writes, "These false-fronted little towns have been holding us together, nothing else. It's no use a woman's thinking that if she loves a man patiently and devotedly enough, she can eventually make him love her too. Philip married me because I made myself important to him, consoled him when he was despondent, stroked his vanity the right way. I meant well. You do mean well when you keep on like that 3 years, slighted and repulsed, determined not to mind. At the end I thought I'd won. More and more years went by, and still I thought I'd won. Even when he was hard to live with, when he closed the study door on me and kept himself aloof. Not till today, when I saw him driving off with Steve, did I know the worth of what I've always called a victory." So Mrs. Bentley makes these remarks time and time again that Philip doesn't really connect to her as husband, that as a woman he doesn't look to her the way other men look to women, and it sounds like one at a time, each individual instance, that it's simply a poor match, that they just don't fit together as well as one would hope. However, the character that she mentions in the passage I just read, Steve, is kind of the complicating force in this. Steve is a 12-year-old orphan, a Roman Catholic orphan, who Mrs. Bentley kind of conspires to adopt, thinking that by adopting this boy, it'll fill the void left behind by an absence of a son, because Mrs. Bentley and Philip did try to have a child it was a stillborn, and since then there's been nothing, and Philip longs for a son. And so Mrs. Bentley thinks that by bringing Steve into the household, that will bring her and Philip together. So even though at the start Mrs. Bentley believes that Steve is the person who will come in to their family and unify them and bring herself closer to Philip, what ends up happening is Mrs. Bentley begins to see Steve as a competitor for Philip's affections. It's played out in very innocent ways. Simple things like things that Philip didn't do for Mrs. Bentley, things that she thought he was doing because he was a sensitive, kind of shy person, he's now doing because he wants Steve to benefit, such as collecting owed money from previous posts that they've occupied. Philip didn't do that before Steve entered the picture, and Mrs. Bentley begins to kind of resent the fact that Philip is so eager to collect this owed money for the sake of Steve, when for years Mrs. Bentley has had to go wearing these poor quality dresses, has had to ration out their meals, but as soon as Steve enters the picture, Philip is eager to collect that money so that Steve will have the best life possible. Philip also shows an emotional and a physical affection towards Steve that he doesn't to Mrs. Bentley. And then Mrs. Bentley kind of observes these sort of emotional and physical displays of affection that play out very innocently. Simple things like Philip placing his hands on Steve's shoulder, or allowing Steve to lean on him while he's sleeping. But these are in like stark contrast to the absence of physical affection that Mrs. Bentley notes in her relationship between her and Philip. So the affection that Philip shows to Steve is very different from the affection he shows to Mrs. Bentley. So where Steve was brought into the family to kind of be this point of focus that will bring Mrs. Bentley and Philip together, the focus of desire actually shifts, and it becomes this kind of triangle in the family. Raoul notes that the triangular narrative structure is reflected in the shifting pattern of relationships in which the Bentleys are implicated, each occupying in turn the position of desiring subject, desired object, and analytical, jealous observer or third person apparently excluded. Yet the relationship of rivalry draws two conflated, rather than contradictory desires together, revealing the attraction of the same, the homoerotic, in competition with that of the other, the different or heterosexual. Raoul brings up Eve Sedgwick, who Ronnie from Ronlit just brought up in a recent video, and what she says is that for the mediated rapprochement between potential same-sex partners is camouflaged by the presence of a third person of the opposite sex who serves as both decoy and link. So that third individual is there to sort of disguise the actual union that is going on. And so this triangle becomes, as Raoul puts it, an Oedipal family relationship between father, mother, and son. So this is only a theory, and it is one that is complicated by events that happen later in the novel, but it's one that is interesting to consider, and one that I picked up on my first reading and was able to kind of really focus in on during my reread for Hello Hemlock. It is insisted upon in minute ways throughout several of Mrs. Bentley's entries, so it's very interesting to kind of think about and unpack the subtext of this novel. But I would be interested to know what you think of these theories, and whether you picked up on some of these threads when you were reading, or whether your attention was more on other themes and more on other topics. So that's it for me, but be sure to check back soon, because we're going to have videos from Nicola from Robotnik, Emily from Kites and Carpetbags, and of course Jess from Foolish Oats. In the meantime, you can still talk to us about this by leaving a comment down below, which we would appreciate, or by following us on Twitter at Hello Hemlock. We love to tweet you back. And we're also talking about the book on Goodreads. We've been leaving some of our favorite passages, and now that this video is kind of up, I'm sure we'll be talking about more in-depth discussions, so join us there if you want. So there will be 3 other videos about As For Me and My House up on this channel, and I can't wait to watch them. But if you do make a video about As For Me and My House, let us know so that we can watch it and we can comment and we can share it. Thanks for watching, and I hope to talk to you all soon. Bye.